For Hegel, everything is contradictory. And so that can also seem to be a kind of mystical way of not allowing us to draw any boundaries or limits or make clear distinctions.
He was sort of obsessed with life and love, if we think of it in those bigger terms.
Objects must conform to our knowledge if that is to count as knowledge and experience in any meaningful sense. To eliminate the subjective aspect, the subjective perspective from knowledge and experience would be completely unintelligible. Self-consciousness is a kind of subject-object phenomenon because it's a way in which the subject can grasp itself as an object of a certain kind. Kant made self-consciousness so central to his philosophy and yet didn't give us a theory of it. The model for thinking about living things, so not consciousness, but certainly bodies, was the model of a machine. And that reached certain limits that we very quickly run up against when we tried to understand living animal bodies on a more mechanistic machine model. The importance of understanding the phenomenon of life was also in part to help us understand something about ourselves, because the model of a machine very quickly is not the right model for thinking about the unity of our mind. A tree is, he says, organized and self-organizing. It takes in materials from the environment to sustain and reproduce itself.
We can never quite be located in either of those dualisms. It pops it out into a complex system. We don't have to take one side or the other anymore. Instead, there's something more organic.
So it turns out self-consciousness isn't the only subjective perspective on the world. If we look at nature, we can actually see that there are similar forms, similar structures. The thought is that self-consciousness is self-conscious life. We can't just drop that self-consciousness is self-conscious life is very significant. A lot of what the science of logic is about is the conditions for intelligibility. Thinking isn't disembodied. Reason is living activity. It's still radical, and we're still trying to find ways of understanding the mind that do not reduce it to a machine, and to insist that minds have to be living. That the concept is free love. What a wild thing to say, but I think we should take him serious. I think he means it. True union, or love proper, exists only between living things who are alike in power, and thus in one another's eyes living beings from every point of view. To love someone is to see them as fully alive. Reason is living activity. That's what it is.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Love and Philosophy. After 1 week off, we're back, or I'm back, and I'm going to post a conversation I had with Karen Ing about Hegel's concept of life. You've probably heard me talk about Hegel, or you know that I studied Hegel, and his idea of the problem of contradiction, which is this central idea in his work that everything, whatever you want to call everything, concepts, ideas, processes, however you want to define it, has some sort of contradiction contained within itself. So the process contains its own opposite, so to speak. I'm not going to go into all that here, but I mention it because Karen and I dance around and talk about it in terms of how we might understand Hegel's work as a rhythm or a pattern to help us hold the paradox. Karen Ing is the Associate Professor of Philosophy and the Director of Graduate Studies at Vanderbilt. She's also George S. Allen Chancellor's Faculty Fellow and an Associate Professor of German, Russian, and East European Studies. She specializes in 19th century European philosophy, especially Hegel. Karen has done a lot of research in post-Kantian philosophy and the connection between Kant, Hegel, Marx, and others of the Frankfurt School. The book we talk about here is Hegel's Concept of Life, Self-Consciousness, Freedom, and Logic, which was published in 2020 by Oxford, and it won the Journal of the History of Philosophy Book Prize in 2021, and it explores the concept of life in Hegel's philosophy, which is what we talk about here. This idea of process, rhythm, movement that I feel one understands when reading Hegel, but can never quite put into words. It's part of the movement of the writing, this expression of how everything already contains its opposite, and how I would say that it's not actually an opposite. It's part of this movement that we make towards understanding the process. Karen and I talk about her book through this lens in a way, and I enjoyed this conversation very much. We had it quite some months ago, but I'm posting it now because it goes very well with the one I just had with Evan about subject and object, which you might think of as a problem of contradiction, so to speak. She's the Alexander von Humboldt Research Fellow at the Center for Post-Kantian Philosophy at the University of Potsdam, which is one way I came across her work because of being in Berlin, and she was there for some talks. But also, her book on Hegel is really one of the best I've ever read. I love that she brings in the idea of life in the way that she does, and how we discuss some really difficult things. First of all, it's just hard to talk about Hegel at all sometimes, much less when you're trying to talk about paradox and process and rationality and the Copernican turn. All of these things we talk about here towards understanding life and love. So that's fun. And I love conversations that can somehow touch on all of those in an authentic way and with passion. And that's one reason I also really enjoy reading Karen's work and listening to her talk. And I hope you will go look at her website and read her book and listen to some other of her talks. She's a great philosopher. I'm also just glad you're here, and I wish you a wonderful and good contradiction that resolved in feeling of love and life. Wishing you lots of motivation and all the best of what philosophy has to offer. Hi, Karen. It's so nice to meet you today, and thank you so much for coming on Love and Philosophy.
Thank you so much for having me, Andrea.
I asked you to come on because I've been looking at your amazing book about Hegel, Concept of Life, and today we're going to try to do something that's a little bit impossible, which is have a general conversation about Hegel. So Hegel's not known to be the easiest philosopher. So maybe to start, maybe we could talk about you and how you discovered him, just to sort of get into this.
Sure. I majored in philosophy when I was an undergraduate, and I came to it, I guess, like many people do. I was very lucky. I first had philosophy in high school. So my first great philosophy teacher was actually in high school. And then what continued to draw me to it was reading in the history of philosophy, but also I was just fortunate to have really good teachers. I think that's a very familiar story, that we need good teachers to bring us into especially a difficult text like Hegel's. So I came to Hegel first as a skeptic. Maybe that's another good way to approach a figure like this, that I came to Hegel as a skeptic. I read a lot of figures in what we now know as the continental tradition that were very, very critical of Hegel. Interestingly, of course, I subsequently learned that the history of analytic philosophy is also shaped by its skepticism towards Hegel. So skepticism towards Hegel in some ways shapes a lot of 20th century philosophy, and I think we see influences of that even today. And so I also came to Hegel as a skeptic, and then because I read all of these people who were all complaining about this figure named Hegel, I figured I should learn something about him. And so I did end up taking a class as an undergraduate where we read the Phenomenology of Spirit. And I just got I was immediately sort of just very attracted to it. I found it very, very difficult. So I don't pretend that at the time or even now that I understand all of it, but there was something about the rhythm and the movement of the phenomenology that just got me to keep reading. And so that's how I came to Hegel, initially as a skeptic, and then I realized, oh, but this isn't so bad.
Why do you think people have this reaction to Hegel that can often be so negative? In the book, for example, you do mention how there's this romantic or this mystical thing that gets associated with Hegel, at least in philosophy circles. It can seem that he's somehow, I think you bring up, what is the term? Hylozoism? Is that how it?
Yep.
Yeah. Or even the Schelling idea that sort of like the whole world is just alive, or there's this feeling of either it's just too hard to read Hegel, this is what I've heard, and it just doesn't make sense, and people get frustrated, or everything is alive and spiritual, and there's a kind of almost mystical monism to it that people just don't want to touch. I don't know what your experience has been with it, but what did you find was so initially that people were so skeptical of about about Hegel?
I think you're touching on some of the reasons why people were so skeptical of Hegel. I like that you call it a mystical monism. Another way of putting it, it's commitment, or rather, its commitment to hyper-rationalism sort of makes it, right, turns it around, and it becomes almost again a form of mysticism because of what looks like the powers. He uses the term, all of the, not just Hegel, but in this tradition, the idea of the absolute, that reason is somehow absolute, and that the worry, I think there was a worry of a kind of hyper-rationalism in Hegel, where reason just determines the world. I think one of the earliest criticisms we have of Hegel's, what looked to be Hegel's hyper-rationalism, nothing outside reason, everything is determined by reason, we get from someone like Schelling. I think on the other side, there is also a suspicion of the way that he treats the problem of contradiction. So on the one hand, there's this hyper-rationalism. On the other hand, there is this acceptance of a certain notion of contradiction. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding here about, right, the exact sense of contradiction that Hegel is interested in. But I think there's a worry that in accepting contradiction, here's where maybe the mysticism comes back. You have this hyper-rationalism, but for Hegel, everything is contradictory. And so that can also seem to be a kind of mystical way of, not allowing us to draw any boundaries or limits or make clear distinctions. And so there is a worry about that with Hegel, if we don't sort of think carefully about what he means by contradiction, just for one example.
Yes, and I like in the beginning you said the movement caught you. I've always thought reading Hegel that it's almost something like what you talk about as method in the book, or a practice almost that he demonstrates with his writing. And I bring that up because what you just expressed is still trying to fit it into these kind of boxes, right? That modern philosophy is severed into, whether it's rationalism and empiricism, if we go back to Kant, or whether it's a certain tradition in philosophy, or whether it's even life and mind, if we want to get closer to Hegel. But also what I've always felt he was doing, or that Kant sort of opened and he opened further, is getting past those dualistic ways of thinking. So just prefacing with that, to think about that modern philosophy has put things in these boxes, this convention even that life and mind are different, or you put life here and then you talk about cognition, which people actually have argued that Hegel does that, right? And what you're saying is actually no, what he's done is show those are inseparable. You can't separate life and mind and cognition and open up this other way of thinking about it. I know that's not adequate to kind of a summary of the book, but just to get us going in that direction, what do you think about that?
So I think you're right. Anti-dualism is something that really motivates. You could look at this Hegel's opposition to stark dualisms, whether it's the dualisms of Kant, whether, as you were pointing out, these more traditional dualisms that we work with in modern philosophy of life and mind, of mind and body. And that it's absolutely the case that the structure of Hegel's arguments often is to try to debunk these dualisms and show us how what we took to be separate is actually deeply interconnected. In the book, of course, what I was most interested in was this problem of life. I think one of the most exciting radical things that Hegel does in his philosophy, and is actually, historically speaking, I think a very interesting moment, because he's writing at a time in the 19th century, sort of just on the cusp of the development of the biological sciences. So that's an interesting 19th century moment. But then he's also harking back to a more ancient moment, because in ancient philosophy, especially in the philosophy of Aristotle, for example, the connection between life and mind, or life and psyche, life and soul, is something that was very deeply explored. And so you could see Hegel as almost, right, working against early modern philosophy, certainly Cartesian philosophy, but more immediately, right, the dualisms of Kant, reviving this more ancient way of thinking about the connection between life and mind. But in this moment in the 19th century, or as we're moving into the 19th century, on the cusp of a new way of thinking about life also in the natural sciences. So I think that's something that when I was writing the book, I thought was really overlooked in discussions of Hegel. So I started by saying that a lot of the skepticism about Hegel concerned his hyper-rationalism, but what I saw when I was reading the text was that if Hegel is a rationalist, right, if there is a commitment to thinking about reason and understanding how reason may or may not shape our world, that understanding of reason and the powers of reason, the powers of cognition, are completely tied to what he thinks of as, right, the powers and capacities of living beings. And so that was one way for me that if he is a rationalist, and I think undoubtedly there's certainly a rationalist, he is a rationalist, there's no denying that. But he has such a subtle and expansive way of thinking about the powers of reason, that in which reason permeates the living natural world. And so that was what drove me to write the book, to think about the questions that I explored in the book.
That reminded me of, I think it's just once very briefly in the book, or maybe twice, you talk about the young Hegel and how he was obsessed with life and love, if we think of it in the way, in those bigger terms. And then in the book, you go through his writing and you show us in the phenomenology of spirit how the absolute negation almost takes the place of what we might think of as life. And also in Science of Logic, we get to the concept and the idea not takes the place of life, because you're basically putting that back into it. But in these old theories, those things would have been the rationality. The focus on rationality is the absolute negation. It's the concept. It's we're all stuck in our head somehow with this rationality. But actually, what you're opening up, or what I was thinking as reading, is maybe this was his way of actually infusing that fascination with life and love into this language. You brought up Kant, and this was the Enlightenment, right? And what was he trying to do? Not save reason, but there was a focus on the Copernican turn. Maybe we could talk about that, because I want to get towards this idea of purposiveness relative to this idea of rationality. How can we help people understand what you're really meaning by rationality when you say that Hegel is a rationalist?
Sure. So there are a few ways that we can think about this trend, this big moment from Kant to Hegel. And of course, over many, many years of scholarship, people have tried to think about this question. And I'm always a little bit careful when I start here, because there's never any agreement. I just want to be clear that there's never any agreement, and philosophers will always disagree about this. But you focused on the Copernican turn, so I think that's a good place to start. And I think I'm a reader of Hegel who wants to stress a lot of the continuities between Kant and Hegel. There are a lot of readers who want to say that there is a radical break, and of course there's truth to both. But in terms of the Copernican turn, I do think so. Kant's Copernican turn, this thought that is so simple and yet so, I think, so profound, that he says, hitherto, all previous philosophers thought somehow that we had this puzzle about how it is that we know that our thoughts and the objects of our thought can somehow hook up together. And Kant just had this insight. It's the Copernican turn, where he says, well, no, objects must conform to our knowledge if that is to count as knowledge and experience in any meaningful sense. And so that sort of that allowed Kant to sort of turn to self-consciousness as a very important focal point for thinking about the problems of knowledge, thinking about questions of intelligibility. Now, there was a worry in the aftermath of Kant that this was too subjective, right? That the accusation of the early of figures like Fichte and Schelling were that this is merely then a subjective idealism if we think that all objects have to conform to our knowledge. And so you could see, again, I'm speaking in very broad terms, this German idealist project of trying to not to go back on the Copernican turn. So we still need to acknowledge the importance of our subjective contributions, the importance of our subjective perspective on any possible knowledge, right? That's something we could say is irreducible, ineliminable, right? To eliminate the subjective aspect, the subjective perspective from knowledge and experience, right, would be completely unintelligible. But we want to find a way to make sure that this isn't just mere subjectivism. And I think that one of the ways in the work of the early post-Kantians to try to resolve this problem, square the circle, was to precisely turn to thinking about nature, think about whether or not we could identify within nature aspects that already looked like. So it turns out self-consciousness isn't the only subjective perspective on the world. If we look at nature, we can actually see that there are similar forms, similar structures, similar, right? We could now say sort of proto-cognitive aspects or proto-cognitive shapes within nature that could allow us to see that this wasn't merely a subjective idealism when we say that something like, objects have to conform to our knowledge. We see this kind of activity taking shape, right, not just with us, with self-conscious human beings, but already with different forms of nature. So that's one initial way that I try to get into the problem. And what I try to show actually is that Kant, in a work called The Critique of Judgment, which we now call the third critique, in a way already gave us a first step into this problem, because one insight that Kant comes to in the third critique is that when he's considering the problem of the human power of judgment, he immediately sort of comes upon this puzzle. And he says, well, if nature was completely chaotic, showed no unity, no regularity, no form whatsoever, he sort of came to this puzzle that it's not clear that judgment, the power of judgment, the power to, right, just bring unity to nature's forms, it's not clear that it would work at all if it was the case that nature was just, right, completely chaotic, as he likes to use this term, a crude chaotic aggregate. And so in a way, Kant himself comes to this problem of life in living form in thinking about the question of judgment himself in this text from 1790 called the Critique of the Power of Judgment.
Yeah, the reason I brought up the Copernican turn and I'm trying to bring up the Enlightenment and stuff is I'm trying to get at what was really going on. Why was this so important? Why is it still so important to us, in a way? Because it's kind of a caricature, but let's think of the Enlightenment, the time, and more focuses on machines and less on something like our inner subjective understanding of the world or something like this. And Kant sort of does this thing where in the way you just described, this move of we can start to understand that you can't separate those things, right? That the object being studied and the self-consciousness or whatever are tangled up. Isn't that kind of what idealism in this sense is, would you say? Or would you unpack that better, or do you think?
Absolutely. I think this idea, there's this term, it's a kind of technical term, but in some ways you described it very well, that gets used, and I talk about it a lot in the book, this idea of a subject object, a kind of hyphenated term. And that can seem, right, what is this weird thing, subject object? And in a way, what you're describing is exactly the point, right? That we have to understand the subject and the object is intimately bound up together. Hegel and some of the other idealists use the term subject object to think about the problem of self-consciousness, right? Self-consciousness is a kind of subject object phenomenon because it's a way in which the subject can grasp itself as an object of a certain kind. And then very importantly for Schelling and Hegel, they refer to life as a kind of subject object, in part because living things are subjects because they have a perspective on the world and on their environment. So they are subjects of experience. That's a term that we now use as well. On the other hand, of course, they are also objects, right? They can be perceived by other subjects. They have an objective shape, an objective form. And so this idea of a subject object is actually very important for the idealist.
Oh, I love it so much. And that gets towards the speculative identity thesis, which is a big part of the book. But these are very hard things, right? So I hope it's okay that this is kind of messy, but I just think it's worth trying to relate this in a way we're trying to understand the world. We create all of these machines and we start to put our sort of, our trust in the external, like in understanding science as something external. But then with Kant and idealism, we at least get this feeling that it's all important. We can't separate our mind and our internal entanglement with that world from those objects that seem so scientific, let's say, at this time. And he shows us in a sense, I guess, that we can take it all seriously. We don't have to necessarily say subjective is bad or objective is bad. But he doesn't really talk about self-consciousness, does he? I mean, it's more,
Kant,
yeah.
because
It's all about it, but he's not exactly, yeah.
That's right. That's so this is something I'm making reference to another scholar, but yes, very famously, self-consciousness is very important for Kant, but so the story goes, he doesn't have a theory of self-consciousness. And it's really only with Fichte that we get a theory of self-consciousness. And so I think this is, like everything, as I said, everything is disputed in the literature, but that was for a long time a thought that Kant made self-consciousness so central to his philosophy and yet didn't give us a theory of it. Let me pick up on something you said about machines and this problem of machines and mechanism. I think another reason to think about why the concept of life is so philosophically important for this period is there is a debate about mechanism and teleology. I think certainly, and this is even before Kant, in a kind of Cartesian way of thinking about the world, the model for thinking about living things, so not consciousness, but certainly bodies, was the model of a machine. And that reached a certain, as you can imagine, right, there were certain limits that we very quickly run up against when we tried to understand living animal bodies on a more mechanistic machine model. And even and in Kant's third critique, he also, right, in trying to understand the distinction, so his way of thinking about the very special form of self-organization of living things, he thinks about this, he calls it internal purposiveness. And the contrast for him, he says, well, imagine a watch, which is obviously, right, very well organized. We understand how the parts and the whole work together to help us tell time. But there's still a difference between, right, whatever unity we want to and functionality we want to attribute to something like a watch versus the unity and self-organization that we want to attribute to a living being. And so your mention of this problem of machines is actually really important because the issue of understanding life and its unique organization, its unique unity, its unique perspective on the world, we could say the interest in that wasn't just about an interest in figuring out nature, although it was also that, right? We also want to understand, right, nature as a whole and nature as a system. But the importance of understanding the phenomenon of life was also in part to help us understand something about ourselves, because we wouldn't want to think about our minds, our cognitive, right, the unity of our mind. We see that the model of a machine very quickly is not the right model for thinking about the unity of our mind. And then even more importantly for this tradition, the problem of freedom. If everything in nature, including ourselves as a part of nature, operates in accordance with a deterministic flow of causality, what Kant is going to call, right, this mechanistic flow of causality, that also threatens our understanding of freedom, our understanding of ourselves as self-determining, as being able to set our own ends, as opposed to just, right, being determined on the basis of a causal flow. And so the interest in life, while of course we're interested in understanding nature and the natural world around us, the stakes of having an account of life, the philosophical stakes of having an account of life, was also about having an understanding of ourselves, an understanding of our mindedness, as much as an understanding of our own freedom.
Wonderful. Yeah, very well said. I guess what I'm trying to set up in a way is there's still this bifurcation going on, almost as if the world is there and there are machines and then there's nature and then there's us. And I feel like in the book, opening up this idea of purposiveness, which comes out of Kant's third critique, and you spend the first part of the book unpacking that, and we can say what that is now. But I feel what I'm seeing happening, and you can completely disagree with this, is that we're opening up the space around that bifurcation. And then we're going to get this kind of movement that you talked about at the beginning, that Hegel's going to come in with this speculative identity thesis, subject object. We can never quite be located in either of those dualisms or those things. And in a weird way, it pops it out into a complex system where we don't have to take one side or the other anymore. Instead, there's something more organic, lifelike. But to get there, Kant had to sort of, first of all, opened this up. He sort of linked the inner and the outer world, even if he did it in a very different way than Hegel is going to do. And I think the way he sort of does that is the way you're pointing out. And when you look at the third critique and this idea of purposiveness, inner, external, maybe you can unpack I know you took a whole book to do it, but just for people who haven't read the book yet, what this really means, this inner purposiveness, moving towards this speculative identity idea.
Good. So the problem and purposiveness is sort of a clunky word, but it's trying to think about the problem of, right, so thinking about the problem of the unity of form of nature. And this is where Kant also, I had mentioned earlier that Hegel was sort of reviving some Aristotelian ideas, but Kant too, in the third critique, in a way, is doing that. Again, trying to do it in a way that is, doing it in a way that attends to the Copernican turn, trying to do it in a, right, many years lie between Aristotle and the 18th and 19th centuries. So trying to take into account, right, things that they know, the scientific theories of their time. But in a way, Kant was also trying to revive a certain Aristotelian idea. And the thought, so the main, one very important distinction that I talk about in the book, and this is drawing from Kant, is a distinction between internal and external purposiveness. And the idea of a purpose is pretty straightforward, right? It's the idea of an aim, a goal, an end. How do we understand? And this is very controversial in Kant's time, because basically Aristotle thought that everything in nature had an end or a purpose or a goal. And then in modern, and I'm also doing this very sketchily, the short version of the story is that in modern philosophy, the idea of ends and purposes were sort of wiped off the map, that it was not, that there was something mystical and something very inappropriate about thinking of nature as, right, guided by goals or ends. And Kant sort of comes back on this he basically sort of starts to think about this problem anew. And the distinction he draws, so external purposiveness is a way of thinking about nature as being organized by goals or ends that are, it's external because it's given by something else. And this is an idea that Kant entertains, but I argue that he ultimately rejects, which is that, well, maybe we can think about nature as on parallel with an artifact, right? And if an artifact has a designer, then maybe nature sort of has a designer god. And we can think of the organization of nature as having aims or goals or purposes that are given by a designer god in a similar way that artifacts have ends or purposes or goals that are given to it by its designer. That's what he calls external purposiveness. Another sort of maybe less extravagant way of thinking about it is that he also says, well, we can also see external purposiveness as a way of thinking about usefulness. So he says, sandy soil is useful for spruces. Well, isn't that handy? Isn't that nice? So that's also, we could think of that as a relation of external purposiveness. But Kant, I argue, and also I think all of the idealists, Schelling and Hegel as well, think that this is a very bad way of thinking about the organization of nature. Hegel has a joke somewhere where he says, oh, well, then we think that, God made cork trees so that we could have corks, right? That's the sort of, that introduces a kind of arbitrariness, they think, in our understanding of nature that doesn't really grasp what is distinctive, right? That basically, we can't distinguish between artifacts and nature at all, because in a way, if nature is an artifact, then, right, we lose the very idea of nature. Internal purposiveness is a way of thinking about nature as setting, right, nothing but the unity and form of the organism, and I'll stick with an organism, sets its own goals in accordance, right, with its own activity. And so here we do not see aims and goals as given from the outside, whether it's an artificer or whether it's from any other outside force, but that living beings have an intrinsic unity, a form of self-organization that sets its own aims and goals and purposes. And it's very important. This doesn't have to be done intentionally, right? So we can see that, because Kant's example is a tree. He says that a tree is sort of, or he says, organized and self-organizing, in that it reproduces other trees of its own kind. It takes in materials from the environment to sustain and reproduce itself. And its parts are also, right, organized such as to contribute to the functioning of the whole. And all of this, he says, he calls this internal purposiveness because this is a form of self-organization. In contemporary philosophy, a term that's sometimes used is autopoiesis. So there are a lot of connections to the way that Kant is thinking about this is something that we now think of as actually quite helpful for thinking about the internal unity and organization of living beings and what's distinctive about the organization of living beings as opposed to artifacts or other non-living things. And in a way, I think internal purposiveness is similar to what we might say is an autopoietic way of organizing oneself.
Yeah, I was just thinking of the Varela Maturana book, Tree of Life, as you were
Exactly.
saying it. And it's interesting that the example is a tree. So that kind of purposiveness, do you really think of it still as having to have sort of an end or as an end? Or because sometimes in the book it feels more what is beneficial is the purpose. Or I mean, by the time we get into Hegel, it's become more of that movement idea that I was picking up on in what you said, that we've gotten, because again, I feel like we're trying to get out of these rigid categories that we're so stuck in. And these kinds of examples, like the tree, which is a dynamic, ongoing process. And there's this great quote, which you have in the book, that Kant says, where I wish I could remember it, but every form is a form of every other. It's a kind of fractally way in which you can look at any part and it's, there's other autopoietic parts that are part of it, and so on. There's this complex scaling feeling that's starting with Kant that we then see much more of, as you express it in Hegel, of this movement, this subject object, kind of ongoing. But having said all that, do you still kind of really think of purpose as an end in that Aristotelian teleos kind of way that's always so criticized, or was and is still criticized quite often in some circles? Or do you think we can think of purpose in a different way, in the way that you're using it here?
That's a great question. I think the idea of the idea of teleology, I think is itself a very controversial idea, especially when we're
Yeah.
talking
Or
about
Zvek, I think you
nature.
use that more often, but
Yeah, the idea of the idea of Zweck and Zweckmäßigkeit is very much connected to these. Again, as I think it's a way of trying to revive or update Aristotelian ideas. I think the way that I don't know if I say this exactly in the book, but the way I would answer your question now is that you're right. We shouldn't think of it as an end, because end, even the word, especially in English, right? End, it sounds like it's an end point. And already suggests finality, even though,
yeah,
of
it
course,
already doesn't fit with that example of the tree, right? Or that.
yeah. And so one thing that Hegel emphasizes is that in a way, and I think this is very novel and again, really speaks to a lot of our contemporary ways of thinking, life is a process. And so although I do think that there's something very important about the teleological structure of how Hegel is thinking about living beings, not just living beings, but also us and how we set goals and ends, but it doesn't have this sense of finality. It really, for Hegel, is about process. And in fact, this is something that I think he really comes to, especially in the mature work, when he's talking about life in the science of logic. It's all about process. And it's not an accident that a lot of process philosophy, whether you're thinking about Whitehead or more contemporary, a philosopher like Jean Dupré, that process philosophy has a lot of Hegelian roots, you could say, because you're absolutely right. While I think there's something about the teleological structure and form that's very important to how Hegel understands life and reason, the non-finality of it, that it always has to be an ongoing process is very important. And that life for him, right, it's not a thing, it's not a stable being, but really an ongoing continual process.
Yeah, and that fits more with this life itself, in a sense of um, we're trying to get at something that's very hard to talk about, which I think is why probably Hegel writes in a way that seems so obscure. And that's what we were talking about. It's almost like the movement itself within the writing kind of comes through. But I do think we can talk about it in a really practical way too, maybe for a second. I mean, purpose can also mean something like meaning, right? And a lot of this with the speculative identity thesis and going into this is about internal organization. It's about finding a pattern in that movement or regularities in that movement and taking that seriously and that being robust, which would be almost in a contrast to what we started with in terms of this everything is alive and we just dissolve in wonderful mysticism, which can feel good, but he's trying to do a science of logic. It's trying to be very robust in the way that you show in the book, but can we also think of it as really connected to meaning and to actually trying to understand this mind nature connection on a level that really does pertain to our everyday life?
I think it absolutely can. And maybe I'll start. I really like that you connect this idea of purpose and meaning. And I think this is important. So I'll start with a more technical way of thinking about it, but move out to this more general sense of meaning, which I think is for Hegel, has to be connected with life and living things rather than say machines and mechanisms. That's something I think that could really speak to our present moment. But starting with the more technical sense, I think, along with other scholars, but again, other scholars disagree, but I think that a lot of what the science of logic is about is the conditions for intelligibility. So that would be a very technical way of thinking about the condition, right? We would take a few steps, and really it is about meaning, because it's the conditions. What does it mean to say that to make anything intelligible? What are the conditions that allow us to make things intelligible, to render things intelligible is sort of a technical way of speaking about it. And again, I think Hegel's most radical thought, and I'm not sure, I want to say, sometimes I want to say that Hegel is really not just thinks about this in the deepest way, but also really is among the first to make this big claim. I've said that, yes, Aristotle certainly connected life and mind, but I don't know that he connected intelligibility as such, right? Or eventually what you're going to say, meaning as such, as connected with life. And the reason for that is because he thinks that it is only once life comes on the scene, so to speak. And again, so it's not an empirical, he's not interested in the scientific question of like which is still an open question. How did life begin, right? Where does life come, right? That's not the natural scientific question he's interested in. But he is saying, if we're interested in thinking about intelligibility and meaning and how anything can become intelligible or meaningful to us at all, that question only makes sense once life is on the scene, because it's only a question that makes sense for living beings. And that this idea that all living beings have to make sense of themselves and their environment in a certain way. Now, obviously, depending on the living thing, this can happen at a very primitive level for very basic, even bacteria, right? Have to sense and make sense of their environment in a certain way in order to survive and reproduce. That's obviously a very primitive and basic idea of sense making, but that gets more sophisticated with more sophisticated forms of life. And I think Hegel's saying that for self-conscious forms of life, which is the most sophisticated form of life of which we're aware, that sense making, right, the idea of making things intelligible is still connected with the fact that we are living beings, because sense making is only possible once living things come on the scene. And so that's really, so your question about meaning for Hegel is essentially connected with life and living activity, living aims, living purposes. Of course, for self-conscious beings, we have more complicated questions than just mere survival and reproduction. We think about the good life, right? And again, this Aristotelian idea. We also think about reproduction, but reproduction is a more encompassing question for us. It's not just about very basic forms of individual, but about social. What does it mean to reproduce a form of life or a society across history? Is it the case that sometimes entire forms of life, and in English, Hegel's term Sittlichkeit is translated as ethical life, which, although not a very literal translation, I think is a very good translation, because it captures the spirit of what Hegel means with the idea of Sittlichkeit. And so I do think that this connection between life and meaning in a very broad sense that you brought up is definitely something that Hegel thinks about very deeply, maybe more deeply than I think any philosopher that I can think of.
Yeah, especially for his time, because again, Kant hadn't even really used this term self-consciousness. But before I get carried away in that, this idea of the speculative identity thesis, as you were talking, I was reminded, I think you said that you were reading the science of logic in maybe graduate school and you came across an absolute idea that life was like the first section, and it was amazing, right? Because those words seem so far apart. When you were reading that, you were in a space where logic and life clashed, right? This idea of the rationalist that you presented at the beginning, or the logic, it almost seems it's something other than life. And it's
Mhm.
talked about in that way, and you assume it that way. But I guess I just want to go to that moment of what happened for you there, because maybe it helps unpack this weird dichotomy.
That you're right. That was the moment. And that there are very memorable moments in one's life where when you read something where it just floors you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I've had them too.
And that was certainly one of them. Reading this huge, difficult, probably one of the most difficult books that I've ever, even now that I've ever read, maybe one of the most difficult books ever written. And also going back to the beginning of our conversation, all of these myths about Hegel, right? This hyper rationalist. We know that the science of logic moves us towards the absolute idea, which sounds like the most mystical rationalist thing that you could, ever conceive of. And that was exactly my reaction. I was expecting to reach this big culmination. And of course I had known, we look at the table of contents, so you know it's coming. But on that first read, when you finally get there, it is absolutely astonishing. And also that what he talks about there. So although he's very clear, he wants to distinguish. He says, yes, this is what we're talking about here. He says we're still talking about logic, we're still talking about thinking and intelligibility. So we're not thinking about nature. But nonetheless, the content of what he's talking about life, he's talking about corporeality, that thinking isn't disembodied, right? This great, again, a thought that might be very obvious, but given the history of philosophy, is difficult and controversial and hard to think about, to conceive, that corporeality, thinking always has to take shape in a distinctive body, that thinking takes place in relation to takes place within a living body that is in an environment and in constant metabolic exchange with an environment, in this processual character that you were asking about earlier. And that most importantly, thinking is not something that an individual does in a void. Thinking Living things are always living things that live with other living things of their own of other kinds, but Hegel thinks that the most significant relationships are, of course, the relationships we have with others, and that these all of this contributes to how we understand thinking and the powers of cognition, and how we make things intelligible and meaningful, how we make sense of the environment as much as how we make sense of ourselves. And so you're absolutely right about this moment. It was, and the shock that how could this is, coming to Hegel as a skeptic, all of these criticisms of Hegel for over now 200 years, but even if we just stick with the 100 years after Hegel, like how could we have accused Hegel of this when his whole point was to say that yes, he is a rationalist, he wants to think about reason in this expansive way, but reason is living activity. That's what it is.
Yeah, it reminds me of this idea of, how do you say it? The whole idea of the speculative identity thesis, that self-consciousness is the self-consciousness of life, or
Yes.
life is constitutive of self-consciousness. That's kind of radical, but why is that radical in this context?
Yes. So the thought is that self-consciousness is self-conscious life. And that life part isn't super, like we can't just drop that self-consciousness is self-conscious life is very significant. It's very radical from the perspective, again, if you think about the trajectory of modern philosophy and Descartes, and maybe every philosopher is unfair. I'm sure there are better ways to think about Descartes, but we'll just use Descartes as the bad, as sort of the bad
Well,
guy.
he opened up something that helped us get here, but there is this, again, that bifurcation, just to link it to what we were
Exactly.
talking about. That's very real and very
It's very
solid.
real. And so this Cartesian way of, because in a way, Descartes was also that's what the I think is, right? The I think I exist, or I think I am, to associate thinking. But for Descartes, right, thinking is thinking substance. And so there are these stark dualisms. It's absolutely impossible on a Cartesian view to think of self-consciousness as self-conscious life. And
sorry, but that is just amazing, isn't it? It really is true what you just said, that it is, you can't think of self-consciousness as self-conscious life in that worldview, which, what is it then? You know?
it's very, so, you've really emphasized the danger of these dualistic ways of thinking. And I think as Kant does a lot, so I don't want to be unfair to Kant, but Kant hangs on to this dualism in his understanding of self-consciousness. The distinction for, the most important distinction, the closest to something where we might get like a Cartesian like dualism in Kant is the distinction between noumena and phenomena. And so while I think Kant is a much more sophisticated, right, even in his dualism, he's much more sophisticated than someone like Descartes, it's still a dualistic picture where we cannot think of self-consciousness as self-conscious life. And there are also, Kant has moral, there are, right, in his theoretical philosophy, there are reasons for that. But I think the more important reason for Kant is his moral philosophy, which we don't have to get into. But what does it mean to say that a life is constitutive of self-consciousness? You've been making reference to what I talk about in the book as the speculative identity thesis, which is really just a Hegel's technical way of thinking about this idea of the subject object that we've talked about, where life is one of the primary models for this speculative identity of subject and object. Well, for one thing, cognition, I think, and this is something we really only get in the logic, that to understand cognition is to understand something about these three fundamental processes of living beings. That understanding powers of cognition requires that we understand them as embodied. And so different living bodies will have different powers of cognition. And again, something that strikes one, especially for today, as something obvious, but I think for a long period of the history of philosophy, we didn't want to think about human cognition as in any way connected with the powers of the human body. So there was, again, at the time, something very radical about this.
It's so radical. I'm sorry I keep pausing, but it's just, for me, this is a really important thing that you've brought up in the book, and that you show in a way that's very robust. Because after reading the book, it seems obvious, right? That life is constituted of self-consciousness. But if you're coming out of a philosophical tradition, it's really not obvious. And weirdly. And even now, it's kind of, we still don't want to take the body too seriously. We still, now we think of mind as like a machine, again, a computation, a computer or something. So I guess I'm just trying to, for people listening, there's really something very fascinating that for so much, it took Kant, it took Descartes, it took these people going through this to even just open it up to where we could imagine our thoughts, our mind as connected to nature and life. That's a really revolutionary thing, even though it now is starting to seem a little bit simple. We almost had to bifurcate to even get there, to the mind body.
This is right, but I want to say, so there's a certain sense in which it now seems obvious to us that minds have to be living, but you mentioned the computational theory of mind. This is so actually it's still radical, and we're still trying to find ways of understanding the mind that do not reduce it to a machine. You mentioned the work of Varela. I really admire the work of people like Evan Thompson. I think Evan Thompson is one contemporary philosopher who's tried to give us ways of think. Right, he talks about Kant's third critique. He talks a lot about Merleau-Ponty. I think people give the idealist tradition, maybe because they're so difficult. I don't know, maybe because of, we started by saying just how difficult it is to read Hegel. Also the complicated history of the reception of Hegel. So I think right now we're not drawing on these really important resources from German idealism to think about these questions. Another contemporary philosopher whose work I really admire is Peter Godfrey Smith, who also is now just trying to think about the deep connections between the life and mind. And this is not easy to do. And so even today, I think it's still quite a radical thing to
Mhm.
argue against a computational theory of mind and to
Yeah.
insist that minds have to be living, that
Yeah, it's
machines.
great you brought that up because it isn't easy actually philosophically to draw a line from bacteria, I think you mentioned, and trees and life and nature, which you have to kind of accept all of that once you start thinking about life and nature, to our experience of ourselves and mind and thought and memory. That's a very hard thing to trace. So even though it might, when I say it in this big way, obviously life is constitutive of self-consciousness, it sounds obvious. Once you really try to do it philosophically, it's very hard, which is why I think your book is really important, because I do think we can look at Hegel in this way for help. And it's also connected to these themes we've been playing around with in terms of what Kant was trying to do. We're always like on the seesaw between these dualisms. And I do think in your book you show another way, or Hegel shows another way. Fichte to Schelling, you can't separate. It's all that time period, right? Which
Yeah.
we haven't talked about those guys yet, but that's all connected. But I do feel like, and I wonder if you also see that as a possible way of rethinking some of these ruts that we've gotten stuck in, a la Evan Thompson's blind spot, right? This movement of subject object that doesn't have to be located in one of those bifurcations.
Exactly. It's so interesting because earlier we were talking about Descartes, but there are these habits of thought, this bifurcating, this separating of the subjective and the objective. It comes back in so many different forms. One thing that I thought about when you were talking earlier in contempt the hard problem of consciousness.
Yeah.
The contemporary way of thinking, right? So everyone thinks, oh, well, no one's Cartesian anymore, but we still have something called the hard problem of consciousness. And so the tendency to think in this bifurcated way, the biggest version of it is the bifurcation of subject and object, right? If we want to put it in the most general terms. And I think if there was one plea that I mostly work in the history of philosophy, but I would love for people to take Hegel seriously, or to take Hegel as somebody who can offer insights into resolving some of these problems. I think some people have turned to, like in the work of Evan Thompson, turned to phenomenology, the work of Husserl or Merleau-Ponty. I actually think the German idealist tradition maybe has more to offer, in part because they thought so much more deeply about this problem of that life and mind have to be connected in order for us, that is in a way the solution to all of these problems of bifurcation.
I actually
um
think extending the idea of phenomenology, it is phenomenology of spirit. This is a
that's
word that
right.
is there. I actually think we could extend it a bit because there's a lot of overlap already between phenomenology and the tradition of taking nature seriously, for example, and what Hegel was trying to do and what you actually express in this book. It's hard because we can't think in those either or categories that our language and our philosophy are really built upon. Everything's so stuck in that, which I think is why it's so hard to read Hegel and understand Hegel in a way too. Not that he figured it out, because really a lot of it comes from Fichte and Schelling and that whole thing. And but there's an expression of it there that I do think we're trying to express better, right?
Yes, and I do. You're touching on something that sounds right. That one reason why is Hegel's text so difficult, right? Was he just trying to be obscure? Was he just trying to be annoying? Obviously, there are also translation issues, but it's just one reason it's so difficult is because he's trying to find a language to understand exactly to people talk a lot about Hegel's dialectics and the dialectical mode of expression or a dialectical method. One very straightforward reason why Hegel is so difficult is that he was trying to capture, right, the movement and contradiction and processes of things in a language, right, that was true to
The
them.
Offhaven, I think, captures it a little better. It's weird, you don't.
Right.
I love it in the book. You don't talk about dialectic till the very end. It's kind of like a little beautiful send off, right? Because
Yeah.
that's the thing everyone associates with Hegel, but and it is that this kind of movement, isn't it? This what you were just expressing, or this feeling of things layering and sublimating and changing and moving. We don't have a good language for that yet, but in the book you're starting to show how we could, right? It can be robust if we look at it.
Yeah, I hope that's what I was trying to convey. And I don't even it's not even that I think Hegel did it, definitively or perfectly, but he really, it, you know, returning to his text, I think, can help us with a lot of the problems that we still struggle with, that, as you put it, are often connected with this tendency to bifurcate.
And that is, it's Schelling who has the subject, object, subject, that sort of, that you
Yeah.
tie in very closely to this idea of what we're calling, or what the speculative identity thesis. We could also just say it's almost like the dialectic movement, or this pattern of that we're talking about in a way too, from a form-based angle, maybe.
Yeah. Schelling, and I think reading Schelling is also very difficult, but I think one thing I try to say in the book is that some people think that in the early Hegel, Schelling was an important influence, but something that gets dropped. And I try to show that this is not, that Schelling is actually more important in the telling of this story than he's been given credit for.
Yeah, I love it that you bring all those people in, because I really feel like it was almost a spirit or a time
Mhm.
where people were trying to do this, try to find some way to hold these paradoxes and talk about them, bring nature back in, still connect on a bodily level with the world, but also in a really robustly logical way. I guess to go back to your journey just a little bit before we end is, so you discovered that life in the logic, and it had one of those moments for you, which I think a lot of us know, where it's just things are brighter or something. You can't leave it behind. How did that proceed on into this book?
So it was, these I guess maybe all books that they take a long time. They have a long gestation period, and so when I was a graduate student was when I had that moment. It was in a seminar. I took a year-long seminar on the science of logic, taught by the late and wonderful Richard Bernstein. And so I had that aha moment. And then I spent, so the origins of the book was my dissertation. And then after I wrote the dissertation, it took me a long time. I basically rewrote the whole thing. It's very interesting, hard process of, in a way, I had the thought, and dissertations are often like this. You have the thought, but the execution is not, you're not happy with the execution. And so it was sort of, yeah, it took me a long time to to write it as a book in the form that in which it eventually appeared.
Trying to connect it to your purposiveness and your dialectic, not to be too silly, but there's something I wonder, like, how it's changed your way of being or thinking, or if it connected to you because of some way that you are in the world. I don't know why it's coming to mind, but in the book you talk about that this, for Hegel, this, what we've been describing, this process, dialectic, speculative, whatever you want to call it, this movement, this pattern that he noticed, then kind of let him look at nature differently, or almost
Mhm.
look at other kinds or species, or like start to almost think about what it might be like to have this purposiveness, almost enter into different perspectives. And I just wonder if that connects in your life at all. What does it bring up for you?
I mean, it has changed. It was an aha moment. It has changed the way that I think about, how I think about, but also how I relate to nature. I think that can sound so, I don't know,
It can
cheesy.
sound cliche, but it's really not. I
Exactly,
mean,
but
this
it
is actually
totally
real,
has.
what matters.
It
It's just hard
totally
to talk
has.
about.
It completely has, to think of the world as alive with a plurality of forms of life, and alive in a more robust way, not just, we know, of course, when if I'm on a hike, I know that there's life all around me, but that all of this life has a perspective on things, and that there are sort of an infinite number of these worlds. And so it actually has absolutely changed the way that I think about the natural world and relate to it. I think it has a lot of, not just for me personally, I think it's this view of life and living nature as a whole, I think could have a lot of ramifications for our present way of relating to nature, given our environmental crisis. I think it's an absolutely it's a super helpful, again, we need lots and lots of different ways of thinking about this, but I think this is one very helpful and important one that could help us rethink our relationship to nature.
Those bifurcations are still there, I guess, that we were talking about at the
Mhm.
beginning, or those divisions. They've changed forms or even accelerated in terms of what you were saying about the way we think of technology and mind. And
Exactly. You've been talking throughout about machines. Obviously, AI is such a huge question and problem and puzzle for us at the moment. You mentioned computational theories of mind. Again, I think there Hegel can give us a very helpful alternative way of thinking about these things. And that it's his thought has been underappreciated in this regard. I know he's been a hugely influential philosopher in many ways, but there are currents of his thought that have been really underappreciated.
it almost seems like we've applied that to philosophy, that either or way of thinking, that you have to choose a side. And so that's why it's been hard to think of something like this in a robust way and bring it in across scales to understand. But I really think that a lot of people are trying to do it from a lot of different angles, and it doesn't necessarily mean that all the stuff from computational mind needs to be gone. If anything, it could, if we could open it up in the way we've been trying to talk about, all of these things could start to help each other in a way, because what we're really trying to do, if we could do it, would be very helpful. If you could really understand how life is continuous with mind, which if we're just thinking of common sense kind of way, somehow we've gotten to this point where we have thoughts and feelings and memories as living creatures in a living planet. And to try to find a robust way to talk about that and trace that out in ways like you or Evan Thompson or, gosh, a lot of philosophers of the past and present are trying to do, it does seem like it could be very helpful to these problems that we have now relative to the environment and technology. I wonder, in your everyday life as a philosopher, if you are able to think about things, if you still have those moments that you had when you read Nature and Logic, because those are other ways we get put into boxes. In a sense, we become professional philosophers and we have this and this and this. I wonder, how is it hard for you to hold all this? Uh, yeah.
For sure. I think this is what makes teaching so important to not just the practice of philosophy, but probably for a lot of researchers, that this contact with students who are always approaching this with fresh eyes for the first time. That is, and also with their concerns, right? Because their concerns are always changing and their world is changing so fast. And so I think teaching definitely helps with that, because you're right, there can certainly be, we get stuck in our little silos, and yeah, professional life is what it is for everybody, including for academics. But I think teaching helps with a lot of that.
And I think that meaning, we talked about purpose, purposiveness, and I brought up meaning, but it does connect, right, to that, because we can also feel like, what are we doing? We're studying Hegel and thinking about all these crazy concepts that don't even make sense to people if you just speak it out, if you try to read it out, a paragraph of Hegel. But actually, it really does connect to these bigger themes, I think. And it's worth the hard work of trying to figure out how to articulate that. I guess that's just a way of saying thanks for trying to do that, right? As a teacher, but also in writing the books. And this is Love and Philosophy, so I have to bring up this word love at the end. Do you see any? I mean, I know Hegel thought about love a lot in his youth, and with Holderlin, we didn't talk about him with the poets, and the life and love was very big for him. And I think it still runs through his work. I was trying to say maybe he put it all into these terms, but for you, just holding all this together, this perspective, this connection with nature, Hegel, what comes to mind with that word for you?
I think Hegel had lots of interesting things to say about love, and in the connection in the early Hegel, for him, love and life were deeply, deeply connected. There was something about this infinite, he used the term infinite structure of life and love, right? That life infinitely returns to itself, and love sort of has a similar structure. You're right that often we think of this as, the early romantic Hegel, when he was, Hegel was very good friends. Hegel, Hölderlin, and Schelling were roommates in the Tübingen Stift. And of course, so Hegel and Schelling broke off and were no longer friends after a certain point. But Hegel and Hölderlin remained friends for Hölderlin's too short life. But I actually think you used this word earlier. You said that it's not that he abandons these earlier romantic themes, but that they get infused into, right, this theory, and including what he says about the concept. And I think that word is, you're absolutely right. I don't think that he ever abandons this way of thinking about the connection between life and love. There's a great passage in The Science of Logic where he's talking about the concept of all things, which is right, you might think this is the most abstract of all things you could possibly talk about. But he says that the concept is free love. and
Free love,
and
before we had that term.
exactly, right. And not in the sense that, that we meant it in the 60s and the
I know.
70s. Right, free love. The concept is free love. What a wild thing to say, but I think we should take him serious. I think he means it. And that there is a consistency in his thought of thinking about something about this, infinite self-return. And also that relationality is very important, that even when we're thinking about something like the concept, it's not enclosed within itself, but always in these, it's only in these relational process of which love is a particularly powerful manifestation, that we can, arrive at something like meaning or purpose or truth. So I think love is a huge theme in Hegel. It's also a model for how he thinks about recognition, which is another really important concept in Hegelian philosophy. So I think Hegel is a great thinker of love.
And do you think this movement, I mean, sometimes we talk about flow, or we talk about there's a kind of when you're present. Sometimes when I'm reading Hegel, I was trying to express, you do feel a kind of presence and a kind of movement that does
Mhm.
something good for the way you can be in the world, so to speak. I don't know if that, I mean, I'm not trying to sound too, it can happen with a lot of different writers in philosophy. It's kind of just something that happens, but I get the feeling maybe he felt that a bit when he was talking about free love. I don't know. Or how would you think this free love? What does he really mean by that?
Well, can I maybe just, when I was preparing to talk with you today, I pulled up this fragment from, there's this early fragment that Hegel wrote about love. And it's wonderful because it's so connected with how he thinks about life. So here's one
Wonderful.
thing, I just read a couple of short things that he says. He says, true union or love proper exists only between living things who are alike in power, and thus in one another's eyes, living beings from every point of view. um,
Oh, wow, that's all the themes we were just talking about in a way, that
yeah,
self-consciousness is life, is all these perspectives, yeah.
but to associate it, that love is to see another as living from every point of view is so, right. So this, to move against bifurcation and fixity, right, to see them, to love someone is to see them as fully alive. He also says love is a sensing of something living. uh,
Wow.
which is also such a, I think, beautiful and profound thing to say. So yes, I mean, going back, so okay, now jumping all the way back to the concept as free love, I think there's a tendency in later criticisms of Hegel to worry that his rationality, his way of thinking about conceptual thinking, is to right, to make things fixed. Adorno loves to say the identity thinking. This is what Adorno accuses Hegel of doing with the concept. So Adorno is a very interesting and astute reader of Hegel in many ways. So I'm definitely not dismissing Adorno. I think Adorno is deeply insightful of Hegel and many other things. But I just think that this idea that the concept fixes is exactly wrong, right? This is exactly what he doesn't want. If the concept is getting something right, it's almost like we are grasping something the way that a lover would grasp something, right? As fully alive, as he says, from every point of view. So yeah, I think that love, although it can seem like once we get to the mature Hegel, love is a less important theme than it is for the early Hegel. I still think it's actually very important.
I think that's right, and there would be so much more to say there about the self-consciousness itself. What's really happening when we become aware of ourself as consciousness. And I mean, that is part of that, trying to see from a different perspective. And if you try to think about that quote that's beautiful that you just read about love, then there's some way in which this movement we've been talking about, and how you can use it to maybe look at different perspectives, that does become, in a really practical way, about love, self-love, the recognition of nature as a kind of love, almost like
Absolutely.
recognizing it as life.
Absolutely. To see it as living from every point of view. Yeah. And this association of love with sensing, the sensing of something living. I like what you said about loving or recognizing nature. I think that's right.
That's kind of the point of of philosophy and science, in a weird way, to do it as robustly as possible. But that's the kind of the doubling too that you talk about. But in any case, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you wanted to bring up? I already kept you 5 minutes over, so.
No, I think we've touched on a lot. This was it was really fun to chat with you about all this.
Yeah, it was. There's always more with Hegel. Yeah, you never get to the bottom, but that's the point of it. But I really do appreciate your book.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Have a great day there in Nashville.
You too.